Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is From Baobab to Marula, Remarkable Trees of Southern Africa. And it'll be presented by our fabulous NatHab expedition leader, Lorraine Doyle. Lorraine, thank you so much for being here today. Really looking forward to this presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it right over to you.
Thanks so much, Sunny. It's great. It's great to be able to be doing this. I think trees are one of the things that I'm very passionate about, and which, I think largely, and I understand why I get overlooked. But I think because they play such an integral part in the whole functioning of ecosystems, I thought it would be really need to just be able to share a little bit about them. So I'm just trying to see now why this doesn't want to move. Sorry, it worked just now when we tried. Do this. There we go. So this was, there's a South African natural history writer called Peter Borchert, and I just liked this quote because I think it does convey because they exist through generations very often, they convey a sense of permanence and stability in our common experience. They've played a central role in human rituals from time immemorial, and sacred groves, whether hidden in the depths of forests or growing prominently on some significant hillside, are as much a part of the African landscape as anywhere else in the world. I just think that that really sums up the fact that because they are intergenerational and stand for so long, that they really do help that level of ongoing connectivity between generations. So I'm sitting here on one of my favorite trees, which we will look at this evening. So this was taken earlier this year in the Kalahari in Botswana. A tree called a camel thorn. As I say, I'll share more about it as we go along. One of the trees that are known to a lot of people. So essentially underneath the common name is the scientific name. And so the baobab is a tree, it's called Adansonia digitata. And the reason that all organisms, living organisms, are classified by this form of nomenclature, it basically just means it's a lingua franca, it's a universal language. So no matter what your language is, whether you speak Russian or English or Spanish, scientists will all know, because the only tree that has this name is this specific tree we're going to be looking at. So the digitata here refers to the shape of the leaves. It has palm-shaped leaves that look like the palm of your hand, with like 5 leaflets on them. So this is the typical iconic shot, if you will. This was taken at Mana Pools in Zimbabwe. And the San people, so the indigenous nation of Southern Africa, have a legend that tells of the god Thora. And apparently, although they don't say why, he took a dislike to the tree growing in his garden. So he threw it out over the wall of paradise onto earth below. And although it landed upside down, it continued to grow. So although it actually isn't an upside down tree, because it does really look so much like one, that's part of its legend. Also is a very unique tree in that although it looks like it has this really thick, sturdy trunk, it's actually very fibrous and corky inside. And so when it dies, it literally disintegrates into nothing. So yeah, it almost like over a period of time will literally just disappear. which I think also makes it quite unusual. So it has these really beautiful white flowers. The bird that's on it there is actually a scarlet sunbird, which is in eclipse plumage, which is why it looks a little bit, rat-eaten or moth-eaten. In terms of pollination of these, so it's quite interesting. There's been a long history of belief that these were actually bat-pollinated flowers. So bats pollinate actually quite a number of flowers. We'll see another one tonight, or this afternoon for you. But more recent research has shown that these are primarily moth-pollinated, and that's quite common for white flowers. So things like gardenias also have these bright white flowers. Many of them are actually pollinated at night and pollinated by moths. So that's also the case primarily here with the baobab. But obviously, as you can see, I mean, it's also birds will come and other insects too. So it has this really quite unusual fruit, which is referred to as the cream of tartar. So the fruit itself is actually, the outer skin is actually quite furry. It's a little bit like a peach on the outside, but it has inside it this cream of tartar inside the fibrous husk, which is actually quite acidic. It's quite refreshing. If it's really, really dry and hot and you have a piece in your mouth, it's quite refreshing. But yeah, you certainly don't want to have too much of it because, as its name suggests, it can become quite bitter. The next tree that is kind of iconic, I think, for many people is the umbrella thorn, which I'll show you a picture of now. And you'll see there under the scientific name, it's got Vachellia and then in a brackets Acacia tortilis. So acacia trees, like this one, with its beautiful flat top, and this lion, when we were actually sitting there looking at the tree, we're actually working with some students, and we were looking at the tree, and this lion just walked across and plonked himself down in the picture. So a bit of a spectacular photo bomb, I guess. But the name acacia applies also to trees that occur in Australia and are hugely important to the Australian timber industry. And so a few years ago now, Africa actually lost the right to use the name acacia scientifically. So this caused much consternation and a fair amount of discord amongst scientists between South Africa and Australia. And part of the reason is that in the rules or the laws of taxonomy, something called primacy holds. And what that means is that wherever the first species was ever described has the right to the name. And the first species was actually Acacia nilotica, which was discovered along the banks of the Nile River. And so therefore, sorry, my dogs started barking at people. I'm sorry. So the Acacia nilotica, because it occurred on the banks of the Nile, primacy should have held. But because the timber industry is so important to Australia, they essentially took the right to the name. So we landed up with the genus Vachellia for trees with straight thorns, and then the genus Senegalia for those acacias that have recurved thorns. However, we still refer to them as acacias. So because it is so iconic. And acanthos, the word acacia actually comes from the Greek word akanthos, which means thorn. And interestingly, the Australian ones have no thorns. The reason for that is thorns are anti-herbivory, so they are there as a defense strategy, and that's not necessary for the Australian acacias. So they really don't get browsed as much as ours do, and therefore don't really need the protection. I often refer to them as African snow because they flower in December, Christmas time, and you get these beautiful, beautiful abundance of these white flowers which cover the whole kind of canopy of the tree. And what's interesting about these umbrella thorns is the reason that they're flat on the top like that. That gives you maximum exposure, leaf exposure for photosynthesis. So it's actually a strategy for survival, if you will. So, whoops, sorry. So bee pollinated, as you can see here, and other insects. But interestingly, they also have another pollinator, which in a way is quite unusual and not something people would expect. But giraffes are the world's largest mammal pollinators. So what happens with giraffes is they will stick their head into a tree that's got new flowers on it. And they really love these flowers because they're very high in protein. And in so doing, they get pollen on their face, on the tuft that you can see there on their ossicones. And after a short time of browsing on a tree, the tree will raise its tannin levels, which makes it very bitter. So the giraffe will then move to the next tree and take pollen with it, browse on that tree for a while, tannin levels will go up, and so it carries on. So you have quite a lot of rodent pollinators, but yeah, the giraffe, as far as I'm aware, is considered the world's largest mammal pollinator. It's by no means the primary or the biggest. I think bees would probably definitely fit into that category, even for these trees, but it's certainly something that they do. So the name tortilis refers to these pods, which look like these little corkscrews. And we refer to them as elephant popcorn because elephants absolutely love them. And along with other trees, like the camel thorn, which I'll look at just now, animals eating these, basically what has to happen is the seeds have to pass through the digestive tract of an animal. And the acid in their stomach scarifies the seed. So what that means is it removes what we call the tester, which is like a covering over the seed. It removes that, which allows the seed to germinate. And obviously, if it gets eaten by an elephant, it gets deposited with a very nice amount of compost, which gives it a really good start in life. So anyone who wants to propagate these trees, acacias in general, you have to boil the seed before you can plant it, because otherwise it won't grow, because it needs that scarification. So yeah, you can also see the leaves are, it's got very, very tiny little leaflets. So each one of those bigger green ones you can see, that's the whole leaf. So it has all these very small, what we call leaflets. And what's interesting about those is the stomata, which is what the tree respires through, and also loses moisture through, are on the top surface. And these leaves can actually fold closed like a book. And so that's actually a way of conserving water in an arid environment. So the camel thorn is the one that I said I was sitting on earlier in the Kalahari. So this one's Vechelia areoloba, and I'll show you where the areoloba comes from shortly. So this tree is actually on the grounds of a lodge that we go to with NatHab trips at a place called Marula in the Waterberg in South Africa. And this is a really beautiful example of this tree. They're very slow growing, they have very hard wood, and so this is an old tree. And it was just starting to come into flower. So this one has these beautiful yellow flowers. They have a combination either of yellow or white flowers. So this one was also taken there. This one obviously growing out more in the main kind of bush environment. But you can see it's got it also has a sort of an umbrella shape, which is typical of these sorts of trees, but just not completely flat top. These are a lot more round on the top. Hence the scientific name Areoloba. And you can see here the leaves a little more clearly, how you can see how they kind of look like a stem in the middle and then little green things on either side, and that's the things that can actually fold closed to prevent water loss, which is really important because these trees in particular grow in very arid environments. So they'll grow in areas like the Waterberg where Marula is, but they'll also grow in the Kalahari. So they cover quite a wide spectrum, and so they're quite tolerant of dry conditions. So this just is a cross section through a pod, and you can see why these might be eaten by pretty much anything and everything that will pick up fruit, browse, because so anything from a baboon to an elephant to small antelope, because it has all of these nutrient-rich seeds in it. And yeah, so it's got a very high protein content and is highly nutritious. It also plays another important role in places like the Kalahari to this bird. This is actually a nest that's has been built by a whole variety or combination of birds, group of birds. They're called sociable weavers, and they build these absolutely massive nests. I mean, these things can weigh hundreds of kilograms. And what they look like from the bottom looking up is these multiple little chambers. So each bird or pair of birds will actually have its own little nesting chamber within the massive overall chamber. And because it's such a huge structure and it's really densely packed, it actually is very well thermoregulated. So it doesn't tend to overheat in the heat of the day, but also if you have very cold desert type nights, it doesn't lose too much heat. So it stays relatively warm. And the little birds that build it look a little bit like a sparrow, I guess. And about the same size as a sparrow, so pretty small, and yet collectively they're able to build these enormous nests. Very often those nests will also be home to other birds, things like pygmy falcons, not the best neighbors because they'll tend to eat some of the sociable weaver chicks. You'll also have seen things like snakes, big Cape cobras will often try and get into the nests to get to the eggs and nestlings. But these trees really are the lifeblood of dry and arid environments. And what's also interesting about acacias in general is they have these nodules on their root system which contain nitrogen fixing bacteria. So trees they need nitrogen in order to produce protein, but they can't absorb it or utilize it in the form that it is in air. And so they have to actually fix it to form a nitrate, and then they can utilize that. And so one of the ways that this can be done is by having these structures on their roots that actually contain these nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So you have this mutualistic relationship. They have a place to exist, and they in turn provide nitrogen in a way that the trees can actually utilize it. So another one of my really favorite trees is a sycamore fig, Ficus sycamoris. And fig trees are, there are hundreds of species of fig trees in throughout Africa. So this is just one. And they have these beautiful buttress roots. So at the bottom, it looks like buttressing. And this one in particular has this pale yellowish greenish bark. So very, very attractive trees found down next to rivers and covered in figs. So these ones are actually, there's one ripe one there which is sort of yellowish, but then there's quite a lot of green figs there that still haven't ripened. And obviously these are loved by many things, from parrots to green pigeons to barbets to monkeys, to all sorts of creatures that can access them. So what's really interesting about fig trees, if ever you've seen a fig tree, you would never have seen it flower in the way that we would consider a tree to flower. So like those acacias have got those lovely yellow or white flowers. Fig trees don't have those kind of flowers. So actually, the fig is a flower turned inside out. So we call it an involuted flower. And so what's happened, instead of having all of the anthers and stamens and so on the outside, like you would expect in a normal flower, they've actually come into the inside of the fruit. So you might wonder, well, how on earth now how does it get pollinated? So it has this incredible, it's called obligate mutualism relationship with fig wasp. And there are as many species of fig wasps as there are species of fig trees. So they have this completely unique relationship. And so what happens is the female fig wasp will have hatched out of her natal fig, and she will then come into figs. There's a tiny hole in the fig called the ostiole, and she will crawl through into the fruit, and in so doing she loses her antenna and her wings, so she loses her ability to fly, and therefore she will die inside the fig. So she will then lay her eggs, and she basically finds this flower, which is an involuted flower. She finds it basically by smell. So you're not going to notice that it's really flowering. So she'll smell it out, and then she'll squeeze through the hole, and then she will lay eggs, and the rest of her very short life is lived inside the fig, and she will die. So the eggs will actually grow inside the fig and hatch in a couple of days. It's really quick. And newly hatched wasps mate with other wasps that were born in the same fig. The males then dig a hole, which allows the females to exit to go to another fig and therefore transfer pollen, and the male will die inside the fig. So because the males are born with no wings, they can basically never leave. So you have this incredible relationship, and the two are dependent, so completely dependent. So for example, if that specific fig tree were to go extinct, that fig wasp would go extinct, and vice versa. So yeah, obligate mutualism. And this is to just give you an idea. So this basically is like the, on this fig wasp, that long tail looking thing, and that's what will basically, she will lay the eggs with. And yeah, tiny. They are probably not even as long as your fingernail on your small finger. So they're tiny, tiny little things, but yet incredibly, incredibly important. So this is another one of our Vachellias or acacias. This one's called Xanthophylla. The xanthos refers to yellow, and it has this beautiful yellow bark. So these trees grow in wet, swampy areas, and hence the name fever tree. So what happened is early settlers to Africa would obviously want to outspan with their ox wagons near water, and they got sick. So they blamed the tree. They got really high fevers, they got incredibly sick, and fairly often they died. And actually, it had nothing to do with the tree whatsoever. It had everything to do with the mosquitoes that were living in the water and which were giving them malaria. But it became known as the fever tree because of that. It has this, like I said, this amazing yellow bark, which is green underneath, and that's actually a powder. So if you rub it with your hand, the yellow powder will actually come off on your hand. And the Zulu people have an amazing belief. So what they will do is if they are going for an interview or an important date, they will actually take some of this bark and they'll make it into like a bit of a pulp. They'll boil it with water and they drink it. And the local Zulu name for this tree is Nkanyagute. Basically means the one that shines from afar. And it's because it stands out so much because of this bark. And so they believe that by ingesting that they will then shine from afar. And so that will make them stand out in a job interview or something similar. So it's a lovely traditional belief. It's also really interesting about these trees is they form what's known as sacrificial limbs. So what that means is that any toxins that they may take up through their roots or in times of drought, they will literally sacrifice one of the limbs. It will die and it will fall off the tree. And in so doing, it will either remove toxins from the tree or it will mean that they have to provide less water to the branch and therefore the leaves and therefore try and get through times of drought. So they have these pretty yellow flowers and then also quite big thorns on them. What's interesting about these thorns is they're actually a modified part of the leaf. And so although they are very sharp and fairly uncomfortable to stab yourself with, they're actually quite soft. And they don't have any what we call secondary thickening in them. So they're not like a little branch. You do get some trees that have those little side branches, which are spine tipped. And those are the ones that puncture all your game drive vehicle tires. And these ones just tend to bend because, as I said, although they're quite mean, if you prick your finger on them, they're pretty soft as well. And yeah, this kind of shows how they shine from afar. This picture was taken on the reserve where I'm based, and it was a very misty morning, and you can literally see how these yellow bark of this tree stands out so beautifully. So another iconic tree is a tree called a weeping Boer-bean, Scotia brachypetala, and it has these amazing, amazing red flowers. So it's quite a large tree. It flowers in the early spring, and produces these masses and masses and masses of red flowers, which everything loves. So this is actually a black-headed oriole, the bird in the tree, and these become absolute hives of activity. There's, again, everything, many insects, things like monkeys as well, flowers that fall to the ground, small antelope will eat. And what's really interesting about these flowers, it gets its common name, weeping Boer-bean, from the fact that it overproduces nectar. So that's an expensive strategy because it takes energy to do that. But what it does is you've got to have a strategy to attract pollinators. And so they produce copious amounts of this nectar, which literally can drip off the tree. So it's called weeping. And the Boer-bean refers to the pods, which have quite large seeds inside them, which apparently, so boer is an Afrikaans word for farmer, and apparently early farmers would roast these and grind them, seeds, and apparently it made an acceptable substitute for coffee. So I'm not quite sure how acceptable, but and I've certainly never tried it, but apparently that was the case. What's interesting in this tree, and a way which it has possibly saved energy, which allows it to produce more nectar, is that the brachypetala means short petals. And so in this picture, the big red structures you can see are actually not petals, like in a rose petal. They are the sepals. So that's what would be green in a rose is now red here. And so you're having a dual function. So the petals are those tiny little things at the bottom, and you can see the stamens sticking out of them. So they've actually doubled up by coloring their sepals and making them very attractive to insects as well. They've saved energy because they're not producing petals and sepals. So a pretty cool adaptation. Another pretty iconic tree that we see quite often on safaris in southern Africa is called a sausage pod, or Cagelia africana. And it forms this beautiful canopy. They're lovely shade trees. However, they are not the type of tree that you really want to plant park your car underneath. And the reason for that is the fruits that form on it. I've got a better close-up of it, but it forms these enormous long fruits, which look quite a lot like sausages, and I guess that's where the common name comes from. Can't actually, not many things will eat the fruits. I have seen an antelope like in Yala, sometimes kudu, kind of nibbling on them, but you'll see now they're actually really fibrous. What does happen in parts of Botswana where this grows, they will take the skin of the fruit, grind it down to a pulp, mix it with some water, and then actually use it as a lotion on their skin for skin ailments. So things like eczema and those sort of skin issues. But yeah, it's certainly not something that is a highly palatable fruit at all. It forms these beautiful red strings of flowers. And I'll show you the next picture. You can see here that how the flowers would all have been on here, and how these then become pretty much the seeds inside these enormous pods. So these pods can weigh up to 6 or 7 kilograms, so really heavy and very solid. And yeah, if that falls on the roof of your car, it's going to put a nice dent in it. So definitely not something you want to park under, nor is it something really that you want to put your tent under either, for the same reason. The wood of the tree is actually quite light, and so the mokoros, the traditional boats of the Okavango Delta, historically were made of wood from these trees. I think in order to protect the trees, nowadays they do make them also out of things like artificial stuff like fiberglass, but the traditional mokoros were made out of wood from here because it's quite light. This is a close-up of those fruits, so you can see they're pretty big fruits. And this is what they look like inside. So yeah, it's extremely bitter. So I've cut one open before and tried it, and it literally takes all the moisture out of your mouth. So yeah, then definitely not something that you really want to be eating. But as I say, it has other uses that it gets used for as well. And then another one of the trees that is incredibly iconic is the Marula tree, and known probably best for its fruits. Scientific name is Sclerocarya berea, and the sclerocarya actually refers to, it has a very, very tough nut inside of it. The fruit is actually what we call a drupe, so it has a stone in it, like a peach. And then inside that stone, it has 3 little seeds, which are extremely high in protein, but really, really difficult to extract. Tree squirrels are particularly adept at managing to get them out. But at one point, there was discussion about almost creating like a peanut butter out of these very oil-rich seeds, but it was just so difficult to extract them that they decided that they weren't going to be doing this. So it didn't go very far. So the darker of the green trees here, the light one in the foreground, that's actually an acacia tree. I think it's probably, it looks like Bachelia nilotica. So the darker green tree in the background is actually the Marula tree. Marula trees are what we call dioecious. So that means that they have a separate male and female trees, and it's only the female trees that bear fruit. And this one happens to be a female tree, and I know this because it's basically outside my room, and it fruits in February, and elephants will frequently come and put their trunk over the fence to pick up the fruits. They're extremely partial. Elephants are extremely partial to the fruits. They contain extremely high vitamin C. So it's been reported more than 7 times the vitamin C that's contained in an orange. And what's really interesting as well is that bull elephants going into must, so when they've got heightened testosterone, their immune systems often are not at their peak at that point. And so they'll also seek out these marula fruits to try and get as much vitamin C as they can, because it does, I guess, it helps boost their immune systems as well. So this was another photo bomb. No, actually the tree photo bombed this one. I was actually taking the picture of these 2 antelope. So these are waterbuck. So this photograph was taken at Mala, which is one of the places we go to on the Southern African NatHab trips. And there's just a nice example of a marula tree in the background. You can see a little bit more here that there's kind of, it looks like they're on the top of a slope. And that's typical of these trees. So some trees don't mind having what we call wet feet. So a lot of the acacias or the vachellias, so Vachellia tortilis, Vachellia nilotica, many of the others don't mind growing in heavier clay soils that are wet. Marulas don't tolerate that at all. They will grow on the higher sandy crests where there's more sandy soil that's better drained. So they need these well-drained soils. And this is one of the things when I'm teaching students, is saying to them, it's actually important to know your trees, because if you're looking for elephants in February, don't go looking down necessarily in the sort of lower lying areas. If there's marula fruits around, you go to the top of the sandy crests looking for elephants, because believe you me, they will be there because there's marula fruits there. It is a myth, a complete myth, that animals will get drunk on the fruit. The reason being is, yes, it does ferment, and you can make a fairly potent alcohol out of it, but animals would have to consume such huge quantities of already fermented fruit in order to become intoxicated that it's just physically not possible. So any pictures you see that will tell you about monkeys or other animals becoming drunk on these fruits is actually, it's urban legend. It doesn't happen. Which was interesting. So during the mid-years of South African history, where you had men who would go and work on the mines, so they would leave their families and go and work on mines in places like Johannesburg. What they would do is they would harvest the fruits of the tree in February and put them into clay pots. They then would bury those clay pots, and when they would come back a few months later, it would have started to ferment and form Marula beer. And I've tasted it. It's a very, very cloudy beer. Can't say I'm particularly partial to it at all. But yes, it is something that is still to this day in local communities where marula trees grow. It is still made. Marula trees are also protected by South African law. We have a number of protected tree species, and it's protected. It's slow growing, and actually traditionally and culturally it's quite important. When I was working in the Sabi Sands a while ago, one of the Shangaan legends or myths or stories, I don't know which it is, these trees, because they are dioecious, so male and female, often growing very close together. The Shangaans that I was working with would say that if there was a couple in the village that were having arguments, issues with each other, they would tie the female to, or the lady to the female tree, the male to the male tree, and let them squabble it out. And then once they'd resolved their difference, then they could be untied. So I don't know if it ever happened, but I thought it was quite an interesting story. It's one of those trees that you can also identify almost by its bark. It was described to me as somebody looking like somebody had been hitting golf balls at it, or alternatively taking scoops out of it with an ice cream scoop, because it has these round patches on it that are very distinctive. There's no other tree that has bark like this. And so, yeah, it has this round pitted bark that makes it very characteristic. Unfortunately, elephants are also, especially in the dry season, they're quite partial to the cambium layer, which is underneath the bark, because it's full of nutrients and moisture. and not only to Marula trees, other trees as well. They will strip bark off the tree, which is fine if it's a small area, and Marulas can actually heal themselves. But unfortunately, if elephants take the bark around the whole of the trunk of a tree, it's called ring barking. And when that happens, you can't get the flow of water from roots to leaves, and you can't get the flow of nutrients from leaves to roots because you've destroyed the xylem and the phloem, which are inside that cambium layer. And so the tree dies. And so, you know, you could consider that in that sense, elephants can be destructive. But there's two ways to look at that, really. One is that if there is an overpopulation of elephants, and they're doing this to a lot of trees, they're destructive, yes. But if there is elephants within carrying capacity, what it means is they will cause a tree to fall over. It will form a habitat for a whole lot of other animals, smaller animals. So you create micro habitats. And in that sense, we then refer to elephants as ecosystem engineers. So yeah, this is just a bowl of ripe marula fruits. They have quite an interesting taste to them. They're kind of, I don't even know really how to describe them. It's quite a unique taste. The skin is quite bitter. So if I ever do eat them, I'll actually like peel the skin away and then eat the flesh inside. And like all fruits that are not commercially being cultivated, there's actually not a lot of flesh on them. You know, the lovely succulent peaches and things that we will buy from a shop have been cultivated specifically for those properties, which is not the case in wild fruits. And then one of the things which South Africa is famous for is amarula, which is a liqueur, a cream liqueur that is flavored with marula fruits. And so here you can see, yeah, it's often very nice just over ice. It also gets put into coffee. So if anyone ever offers you on safari Ranger coffee, it's coffee with amarula in it. They'll also sometimes make things called chocomocarulas, and that's hot chocolate, coffee, and amarula mixed. So yeah, one of the kind of products of Southern Africa that it's quite well known for. So for now, this is also a view that I have from my balcony. The trees that are showing reddish color leaves there, those are a type of tree called a tamboti tree. So yeah, you get these beautiful hues. This is kind of late summer. We don't really have a proper autumn. But yeah, you still get these lovely vibrant colors. So yeah, so thank you very much for listening. I hope that, that perhaps you learned some things about Southern African trees you didn't know. And I'm happy to try and answer any questions. Thanks, Sunny.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. And I will say there were a lot of questions about the amarula, and thank you for answering that at the end. There was lots of interest in that liqueur. Before we start, I just want to remind everyone that they can submit their questions via the questions field in the control panel. Okay, so getting back to the figs. The question is, do you find dead wasps inside figs that you buy or pick from a tree? Don't ask questions you don't want to know the answers to, right?
Yeah. So basically, commercially cultivated figs, you don't have dead wasps inside. And I'm not exactly sure of how they manage this, but commercially cultivated figs don't have dead wasps inside, because it's one of the things, I've had vegan students and they they won't eat wild figs, and wild figs that you pick off a tree, like here on the reserve, those will have dead wasps inside them. Yes. Not that you would know about it. I mean, they're so tiny and so minuscule that you really wouldn't know that was the case. But I guess you would still be consuming some animal protein. But it's not the case with commercial figs.
Got it. Okay. So here's a question about scraping the sycamore tree and boiling it. How deep is tree bark scraped? And, and what is the purpose of eating or drinking this mixture?
So I think, are they talking about the fever tree, the one with the yellow powder on it? So
They refer to it as the
I think
sycamore.
so. Sycamore fig. So generally, in terms of the sycamore fig, I don't know of scraping the bark. The one that people do in order to shine from afar, what they'll do with that is they literally just scrape the very, very surface layer. It's almost more to get that yellow color powder, which the sycamore fig also has. But there it's less of a powder and more of the actual bark that has that yellow coloration. And then it really is, it's a very thin shaving of a small area to literally just make a decoction. So they'll literally put those shavings into water, boil it, and then drink it. And the idea is that in that case, it's believed that it will make you shine from afar, from inside. So it's kind of it's a traditional belief. What is interesting about it is there has been some talk that this is pretty ironic because the tree was considered to cause fever, and yet there are some properties of the bark that appear to be anti-pyretic, which means anti-fever. So yeah, maybe the tree had the cure all along.
How has climate change affected the trees that you spoke about today? Is there anything notable?
At this point, I would say we haven't seen anything drastic. I do know that some of our flowering seasons have definitely changed. Our trees are flowering earlier and fruiting earlier. I guess because it's actually staying, it's warmer for longer. But there hasn't been any noticeable change, as in elevational change, which I know is happening in parts of the Amazon, for example. But as it's got hotter, trees have started literally only growing higher up slopes where it's cooler and so on. I can't say I've noticed anything other than earlier flowering at this point, but nothing more currently.
I think we have time for one more. How does one remove the skin from the sausage pod?
You scrape it off. You basically just scrape it off with you can either use a knife or a potato peeler. So yeah, it literally gets peeled. You can literally peel it off. It's very rough. It's a very rough, almost like sandpaper, I suppose. But yeah, you can peel it off. It's not that thick. It's just quite tough. So yeah, that's basically how it gets peeled. It's either just scrape with a knife, or how do I know a potato peeler works? Because I tried it. That was the time I decided I wanted to try the fruit inside, which was a mistake. It's very bitter. It's not nice.
Well, that's the last question we have time for today. So I'll hand it back to you for closing comments.
Yeah, just to say thank you very much to people for listening. And yeah, I hope people enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed doing it. So thank you so much. And Happy New
Absolutely.
Year
Thank
to
you for
everybody.
taking the time.
Oh, and Happy New Year
I also want to,
for the coming New Year.
yes, yes. I also want to thank everyone who tuned in today. Please join us again tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everyone. Have a wonderful day.